This week On Orbit, I'm joined by my colleague and Viasat editor Mark Holmes as we recap our trip to World Space Business Week. Direct-to-device and defense were the themes that took center stage, with spectrum and a ramp-up in defense spending driving much of the conversation. But change was another theme this year, with a new venue and so many new faces coming together to learn about the space and satellite industry. Mark and I unpack some of the top storylines from the week and share our favorite parts about being in Paris in September. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hello, this is Rachel Jewett, and we are back with our annual World Space Business Week wrap-up episode. I am here with my colleague Mark Holmes. We were just in Paris together last week. Mark, thanks so much for joining On Orbit.
No, it's a pleasure to join you again.
Yeah, it's always an interesting and good half year. I mean, we're past the half of the year, but it's a point where you get to get a lot of the industry together, kind of hear the state of things. Being basically 6 months after Satellite, it's a really good marker of just taking stake of where things are right now. And it was a little different this year with a new venue, and so I think we've got a lot to talk about.
We definitely have. So yeah, what do you want to dive into?
Yeah, so I'll start out asking you, what did you see as what were some of the biggest themes of the week for you?
Okay, I'm gonna start with a couple of things. The first, something that struck me a lot about the event, and even Satellite, is there feels like a little bit of a changing of the guard in the industry. So, there are more new faces than ever in our industry. I mean, there's more new companies that are represented at Satellite and World Space Business Week. There's more younger people at the event. So I really feel like we're sort of starting to see. We talk a lot about space going mainstream and not sort of just being, a last resort type thing. And I think you're starting to see that at events like ours and World Space Business Week, in the sense that it's not just there's obviously still some of the faces I've seen at every Satellite and World Space Business Week over the last 25 years, but more and more now, there's lots of different people coming to these events, representing lots of different companies from all parts of the value chain and the supply chain. And I think it sort of struck me a lot this time in Paris. So that was a big theme for me. The other thing, which I know we'll talk about, topic-wise, defense was massive, as we expected it to be. That's not a surprise. I know we'll talk about direct-to-device, but it really was, I call it, though it didn't seem you could get through one panel discussion or keynote without defense or direct-to-device being mentioned. Yeah. And if you think about that, that's quite stunning in a way, because 3 or 4 years ago, direct-to-device really wasn't a thing. It was, nascent and stuff.
Right.
And now it's becoming mainstream. Defense has always been there. I mean, let's be honest, defense isn't some big, shiny new market that the satellite industry is waking up.
Right,
to.
right.
It's always been one of the top target markets. But it's clear that with the situation the world is in, the geopolitics, the ramping up of government spending, sovereignty in space, and having, we just talked about this recently on our last call, but having eyes in the sky, having your own eyes in the sky, is becoming more important than ever. And I think I think they were just some of the initial takeaways I had from
that. I think that sovereignty was the most used word of the entire week.
Yeah, I mean, it's been around. I mean, we wrote about sovereignty. We've been writing about sovereignty in space over the last couple of years, so it's not some necessarily big new thing. But it's clear that there's been a shift in government thinking, and the importance of space. I think people are really seeing. I think what Ukraine has showed is it's shone a light on what space capabilities can do in a number of different ways, and it's everything from communications to intelligence monitoring, and so it really covers a whole different things. And I think when you have actual conflicts taking place, you get to see real world examples of what the current set of space technologies can do and how they can make a difference.
Yeah.
And that's framing a lot of overall thinking, I think, here.
Absolutely. One of the things I thought was interesting that Rafal Majewski from ISI said in the interview that you did was pointing out that there is new spending now coming from Europe with the NATO countries saying that they're going to increase. The US has always spent a lot on space capabilities for defense, but there is now new money allocated in Europe, and they want European providers. They want to support European space companies. So there's a huge opportunity there, obviously. And I think there's also going to be some growing pains of, are companies ready to scale up to meet that demand? I think we're going to see some growing pains in that area.
Yes, possibly, but I also think it's exciting because I think it's sort of turned on its head. And even when you speak to US companies now see huge opportunities in Europe that they perhaps didn't see 3 or 4 years ago.
Mhm.
So, and Europe probably has a reputation, and it's very difficult because Europe is a group of a number of countries. So, it's difficult to pigeonhole, and say, well, Europe does this, but
Yeah.
but generally the perception is that has been more conservative towards spending in these areas, and it's clear that something has changed. I mean, I think, and I do think it's a combination of factors. I don't think it's any one single factor, but I think clearly what's going on in Ukraine and Gaza is impacting thinking here, because you're seeing real world examples. You have the impact of the role of the US in the global market now, and the impacts. What its role will be in NATO going forward, and will Europe have to almost essentially stand on its own 2 feet a little bit more? And so I think there's a number of things sort of playing into that, added to the fact that it is a time when everyone says that this is the most dynamic period they've ever known in our industry. Rachel, I mean, you've been in a little less than me, but the amount of people that you talk to and say this is the most exciting time, we're going to see more change in the next 5 to 10 years than we saw in the previous 30.
Yeah. I mean,
And
if you look at the amount of investment that has gone in over, let's say, the past 5 years, how many companies at the show this year did not exist 5 years ago, or they were just nascent startups 5 years ago? It's a huge number.
that's the point I was making in my first comment, that sort of change. I mean, when you went to these sorts of shows, Satellite, World Space Business Week, 5, 10 years ago, you kind of knew all the companies that were going to go. You kind of knew who was going to be there, and a lot of them were well represented. Now it's much more diverse. I mean, and I think that's a good thing. And it's becoming, for someone that's been going to these events for far too long now, it's becoming quite stark, the change that you're sort of seeing. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of events and not just in the space industry, but in telecoms, in healthcare, a lot of the events have a lot of the same companies year on year. The big telcos don't really change. And I think what we're seeing is almost some unprecedented disruption in the space industry. And you're seeing players emerge. I mean, ISI is a great example. I mean, all of a sudden, we talked a few years ago, when were we going to have like these big European space champions? When were we going to have these European companies that were essentially going to do similar things to what SpaceX has done in the US and really disrupt the market? And I think, ISI is a great example of, that's the type of company, that we now look for leadership in Europe, and is picking up loads of government contracts, is is hiring, and really doing an amazing job. And I think you're going to have more companies hopefully come up like that over the next few
Yeah.
years.
An investor mentioned to me during the week of when are we going to see someone form a space conglomerate, like a new space conglomerate in Europe? When one of these small sat launchers is proven, are we going to see that combined with some Earth observation companies, a manufacturing company? Can someone buy a number of these companies and bring them together to make a European new space conglomerate? I think that would be really interesting if we saw that.
It would be. I'm not 100% convinced that we will. I mean, I do think I do think we may see over the next few years, and this is a much bigger question, which I'm not sure we were meant to get into today, but I do think we will see some more left field pieces of consolidation over the next few years.
Hmm.
Now, what that entails, I don't know. But like for example, not the obvious thing like a Viasat Inmarsat combination or a Eutelsat OneWeb and things like that. So, you might get something, where two companies, not necessarily in competing sectors, but maybe complementary sectors, get together and they try and offer something more complete. Whether it turns into a big conglomerate, I don't know. I kind of feel like the mentality in Europe is changing a little bit. I think with what we're seeing in Ukraine, there is this need to be smaller, agile, get
Lean, yeah,
technology
agile.
proven
Mhm.
quickly. And if you're part of a big conglomerate, I think you might lose what you wanted to create in the first place. So, it's like all these things. It's clear there'll be consolidation across markets because there's more companies coming up, and that's what happens in markets. Companies buy other companies, but I kind of feel like we will see some. I think we could see some interesting moves over the next few years that we
Mhm.
won't necessarily predict.
Yeah.
That's my that's my prediction. Predicting something that no one will predict.
All right. Another big theme of the week, obviously, as you mentioned, is the conversation around direct to device. And this just the week before, very soon before World Space Business Week, we saw SpaceX buy $17 billion worth of spectrum from EchoStar. And that came under the pressure of an FCC investigation, which has been it's been criticized. So, and now SpaceX has its own spectrum, whereas before they were using mobile network operator spectrum under the sharing frameworks to do direct to device, and so now they have their own spectrum. And in your coverage of Gwen Shotwell's of her keynote, I you know. She talked a little bit about what this is going to mean for SpaceX. And she did say that they're going to be working with telcos in a different way now because it is their spectrum. But she also was honest that there's a ton of work for SpaceX to do. So this spectrum, it's not already in phones. They've filed to launch new satellites since then. She said that they're going to have to work with device manufacturers, chip companies, and there's a lot of work to like actually realize this service now that they have their own spectrum to work with. So this is a pretty big change. And we've also seen AST Space Mobile, which is also using that the sharing framework, has bought some spectrum of its own as well.
So, Rachel, let me ask you a question because I think
Yeah.
you probably covered this a little bit more, and I know you went to the press conference at World Space Busy. What do you make of this? What do you make of the whole SpaceX direct to device and how that's going to potentially shake up the market?
Yeah.
Even with Gwyn's comments and saying we've got a lot to learn and it's a lot of hard work ahead. I mean, to be honest, they probably said the same thing in the launch market 15, 20 years ago. They probably said those exact same lines. They probably
Yeah.
said exact same things before Starlink launched all its satellites. So,
Well, this is, I mean, it is like we already have phones. How many telcos are there around the world? I think that it's a big enough market that one company is not going to be able to provide services to every single cell phone in the world. And that's what makes it so interesting is that there are different ways to provide this type of service. Um, on the direct-to-device panel, AST Space Mobile and Global Star, they said, this only just shows the value of this market and it doesn't change, you know, how they're going to do things. But I thought Iridium COO Susie McBride, she said, I'm glad I'm not trying to raise money against this right now. That basically it is going to make it harder for other people to compete. So, but then we saw another announcement from Viasat and Space42, and Viasat has kind of been hinting at this like shared infrastructure. So they have the spectrum, they have mobile satellite spectrum, and they're pooling that together and trying to do it in a way that can invite more players and that countries can keep whatever sovereignty rules they want in place. So, and Mark Dankberg said that what word he was like, it's a counterpoint to having one big single player in the market. So I don't think that everybody is going to want to work with SpaceX or be dependent on one provider, because that's the problem in the launch market. Everybody is dependent on SpaceX. In with Starlink, it's like there's one dominant player. So I think that people are waking up to the over dependence on SpaceX. And I think that this is an area where there's going to be room for multiple players, and not everybody is going to want to provide the service in the same way.
I also think as well, the other question for me, and it's not really a SpaceX question as such, but it's more, what is the size of this market going forward? I mean, we talk about it a lot, and we talk about the potential. We talk about, these deals that you see, these new companies doing with telcos and things like that. But how lucrative is this? And where ultimately that's going. I mean, I'm sure there are market forecasts on this, but I still think that's a huge question on this, because I think the concept of having a satellite connection in your phone isn't really, or in your device, isn't necessarily a new. It's not something. It's not a new phenomenon. In many ways, it's the holy grail for our industry. But at the same, and we've been talking about telco partnerships for 20 years in terms of backhaul and things like that. So these are not. In some ways, it's new. In some ways, it isn't. But for me, I think the big question is also what this market turns into, and what it turns into from a revenue perspective as well. I mean, I'm really sort of curious, but I must admit, I was surprised just how much we were talking about it in Paris. And I know partly that was based on the SpaceX news. And I think anything when you have a big piece of SpaceX news like that tends to reverberate across the industry. But even aside from that, I was genuinely shocked, and maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was genuinely shocked that direct to device almost was possibly even the number one topic in Paris this week. Oh, sorry, last week. And
yeah.
That did surprise me a little bit.
Interesting. And I have the same concerns or questions as you, because how often are we really outside of cellular coverage, and what would you be willing to pay, and what would you actually want to use? But we know there's an insatiable demand for bandwidth. And is that really going to be absolutely everywhere all the time? I don't know. I kind of think we're a little bit too addicted to our devices. I enjoy it on my plane when there's no in-flight connectivity, actually, which maybe I shouldn't say as a satellite journalist, but I like being disconnected from time to time. But obviously, there are like huge benefits for actual like safety and emergency rescue situations that I think is going to be like absolutely game changing in that area. But yeah, the question of like what level of service are people going to want, and what will they actually pay for?
Two things. You bring up a good point with IFC. And that's probably a market I know probably more than direct to device.
Yeah.
The amount of times you try to connect on a plane to the IFC service and you don't connect, amount of people that tell you that story is insane. So, and we're 10 years in, and this is not a new market. That's one thing. And the IFC market is potentially a cautionary tale because, there was a sense that if, the initial thinking is that you could charge passengers a lot of money and they would want to connect and stuff. And, that model, most are now going through the free model. So, it's business models need to sort of evolve and find the right business case. But that's a market even at 10, 12 years in where people are still figuring that market out now. So it's not easy when and how it relates to direct device, I think, is, these are all really interesting ideas. And I think in some ways, direct to device is like the holy grail for the industry. But actually executing a flawless revenue generating strategy is not going to be easy.
Yeah.
Not just in terms of the competition, but just in terms of how you go about doing it, where the demand is, and where ultimately you get the revenue.
Yeah, completely agree. So you had an interesting idea for this, that we each share an overreaction. So tell me a little bit about the overreaction in sports commentary.
Okay, so an overreaction. So I'm going to start. I'm actually going to go with SpaceX because we love talking about SpaceX and we have huge admiration here at Via Satellite for what SpaceX has done. Gwyn has been a Satellite Executive of the Year twice over, I think, the last 5 or 6 years. Super company. The overreaction, I would say, is SpaceX hasn't had a good year. And people will think, Mark, you're daft. They've over 100 launches, launching way more than everybody else. Starship's finally launched. So you think, okay, but I kind of feel like with the number of failed launches, I'm not sure. And even Gwyn kind of hinted at it that the team needed that success in her sort of fireside chat, that actually that had been really hard work. And I think they perhaps would have expected they would have got to where they are now a little bit quicker. And I think it is a little bit of a barometer for them now. I think, when you go on a launch panel, they're going to have numbers better than everybody else. Their numbers are going to be, quite frankly, staggering compared to what we thought was possible in the launch market. But so is it an overreaction or not? Some people some people might think it's daft.
Because
say that
because that's such a dominant company. But I think that's fair to say because there were very, very public setbacks with Starship, and SpaceX says that there is a lot riding on that vehicle, although they have a thriving business with Starlink and Falcon 9. I also think that Elon Musk's political involvement has given the company kind of like a reputational hit this year, and he stepped back from that. But I do think that in terms of the public and maybe in the space industry as well, that's also something to consider when you look at this year for SpaceX.
So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I was struck by Gwyn's comments because it sort of felt like, she kind of hinted it had been a really, really tough.
Yeah, I actually was surprised at how honest she was about the challenges that still remain with the Starship program. And people have talked about how complicated this refueling propellant, that I'm not an engineer, but people have said, hey, this is basically impossible. And she said, she seemed very candid in talking about how much of a challenge that is going to be.
Yeah, and I think that's, as I said, you sort of see it, in terms of an overreaction, and I think it's a good. So I'd be eager to think what our audience thinks, whether you think it is an overreaction or whether you think it's justified. I think it's an interesting.
Yeah.
So, what about you, Rachel?
Okay, this is kind of a niche comment, but it ties into the sovereignty thing that we were talking about. I think that setting up manufacturing in all of these different countries is going to turn out to be a mess. Everyone is building a new factory in like every country that they're trying to operate in. That's an exaggeration, but you've got companies that are not that companies that are not that mature saying we are going to build in this country, we're going to build in this country, and I think it's going to be a mess. I think that even just the all of the logistics involved in that, setting up a qualified workforce. I mean, there's a reason that centralized, having all of your expertise in one place, that people have done that model for so long. And so I think that this shift to setting up in all these different countries, I don't think this is going to work out.
That's an it's an interesting overreaction, interesting talking point as well, because there are some parallels with the launch market as well, and having your own access to space, and that's clearly gone a lot slower than than we thought it would. Um, I do think countries have been a little bit spooked in a way with what's gone on in Ukraine, particularly countries in Europe where we see potentially a lot of new launch facilities and new manufacturing facilities. I think I think what's happened in Ukraine has kind of made countries have a really hard look in the mirror and
Yeah, definitely.
see if there's
And
you know see what they need to do, and they've also seen, to be honest, and it goes back to the start of the discussion, they've seen what Ukraine has been able to accomplish when they've been in the middle of a conflict, how they've been able to develop their space industry, how they've able to be small and agile and do incredible things against an opponent that is much, much bigger than them. And I think there's a sense like, well, this could be us. This could be us.
yeah,
I mean, everyone hopes it doesn't happen, but I think it has probably led to countries being a little bit spooked. And I think, like with all these things, I think there are good intentions behind looking to do these things. Um, but the one thing we do know is that space is still hard. It's still hard to launch rockets. It's still hard to build satellites, very, very capable satellites, quickly and at scale. These are not easy things that you know the companies are trying to accomplish. And you also have to get back. One of the questions as you know, Rachel, having worked with me now for a few years, one of the questions I always ask in any market is, where is the demand? So if you're putting up lots of satellites, whether you're a LEO, GEO, MEO constellation, ultimately, who are you going to sell to? What's your target? How are you going to get business that because you're competing against a number of companies now. And it's the same, like if you're manufacturing satellites or you're launching, ultimately, you need customers. And if you're looking at a more sovereign approach, is that
is it
ultimately going to
just the government customer? Is the government
yeah,
the only
yeah,
customer? Is that a sustainable business?
and
Yeah,
it feels like you're putting a
right.
lot of eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like, I think we'll see, like we all do with all markets, we'll see winners and losers. I think the manufacturing space is an interesting one. I mean, you know, our satellite executive of the year was a satellite manufacturer that's disrupted the status quo.
Hmm.
And that's probably something we wouldn't have predicted 4 or 5 years ago. That panel that panel at Satellite and World Space Business Week always stayed the same 4 or 5 companies every year talking about manufacturing trends.
Hmm.
So
And now, yeah, I watched both. I watched the primes, that had Airbus, OHB, Maxar, Boeing. I don't mean to leave anyone out. and then the startup manufacturing panel. And it was completely full and by no means representative of all of the manufacturers that are out there. And I was just like, there are so many options. And that might not be, there might be too many. But I'm like, wow, how all of these companies are going to find enough customers. And then, like you were talking about how launch is hard, all of this is dependent on having more options in launch and more ways to actually get to space. Like, if we're building all of these satellites have to get up. And we have not really seen any of these startup manufacturers, launchers, establish a meaningful cadence yet.
No, we
Same
haven't.
thing with Blue Origin and Ariane. They're trying to get, they're just working to get a more regular cadence with their new vehicles.
Yeah, I
A
mean,
lot riding on that.
it's amazing, really, when you think about it, Rachel. We talk about all of these markets, every single one, the dynamics are less like so different to where they were a few years ago. Like the manufacturing, the launch, the operator, the ground, um, and how sovereign and government and everything else fits into that is going to be absolutely fascinating over the next few years, and seeing which companies emerge, and who are able to, not only build great technology, because there's a lot of companies that can build great technology, I think, but actually the companies that can sell that technology and sell the vision of that technology. And I think that's going to be, fascinating to see, okay, who are going to be, if Europe is this hotspot right now because of what's going on in Ukraine, and European governments are investing a lot more in defense and government, how many European space champions might we have over the next 4 or 5 years? How many are going to become much bigger than they are now? No, I mean, I think it's always unfair to say that. One of the things always sort of like people say, "Oh, when are we going to have a European SpaceX?" I think that I don't think we should look at it like that, because I think SpaceX is a unique. It's a phenomenon that we may I think happens maybe once in a, I'm going to use a terrible joke, but once in a blue moon. I mean, it happens once in a generation, once in a lifetime. You get a company like that. And I don't think, Europe necessarily needs its own SpaceX in a sense, but I do think it needs space champions. It needs examples of successful new space companies coming up and making a difference across the community. And I hope over the next 5 years, we talk about Swiss to 12, we talk about eyesight, but I hope we get more companies like that,
Mhm.
that that are real big success stories, and and not just in terms of Europe, but actually European companies on a global scene as well. So that will be I think an interesting thing to
Yeah.
follow.
Yeah. Was there anything else that we haven't talked about that whether it was an announcement or just something else that you found interesting about the week?
I mean, we can talk about the venue. So obviously we've been at the Western. Firstly, Nova Space does a phenomenal job with the event. They've, we know how difficult it is to do successful events, and they do a phenomenal job. So hats off to Pacome and all the team, for what they did. It just occurs to me, like, the satellite industry and change is, even now we talk about a lot of new people coming to the industry, and there is, but at the same time there's still that, almost like that mentality about, it was a new venue, and it was an interesting one. I think I was expecting something a little bit different, if I'm honest. I was expecting, because I from an outside looking in, it felt like the show has been growing because of the interest, similar to our show in Washington. And so I was perhaps expecting the venue to be a bit bigger, particularly the conference side and
Mhm.
stuff. So that was something that I was, a little bit, maybe surprised by.
Yeah,
So
I didn't think it felt that different, and maybe that's a function of what options are available in terms of like sizes of hotels with conference venues in Paris. Yeah, I didn't think it. I obviously the part of the city did feel a little bit different being in the eighth, and just walking around what was around, as opposed to the previous area. I definitely missed being by the scene a little bit, but I really didn't think it was that different. And obviously, it's a great show.
Yeah, I mean, there was more sort of, it definitely felt like there was more exhibit space downstairs. I mean, that
Hmm.
was a little bit different. Um, and it did. I think the Western has a very unique feel about it. The way it's almost like that. It's almost like a square in a way, and you walk around and you have that sort of cafe in the middle. So I think it would take a little bit of yeah, and it's in a new area as well. And I think when you've been to the Western for so many years, you know the cafes, you know the restaurants that you like to go to, and
Yeah.
all, and you're walking out and you're like, where do I go now? I have no idea. And I know there's that one restaurant on the street opposite the venue. I mean that cafe must have done a roaring trade that week because that was literally the one. That was the one within a couple of minutes. So I think it was, yeah, it was. I mean, from what I heard, there was sort of mixed feedback about the venue. I'm sure Nova Space has been hearing that as well. But it was always going to be that way. I mean, when you've been somewhere for 20 years and you go somewhere new, I personally, I'm intrigued to see. From what I understand, the Western is undergoing some kind of refit and stuff. So I'll be intrigued to see whether this is just a temporary move or whether they ultimately will go back
Yeah.
to the West. And so I think it's always, but you know what, Paris is a beautiful city. I mean, I can't, spending 4 or 5 days in Paris, whatever district is, I'm never going to complain about and stuff. And as I said, I think Packham and the team did a great job with the event, and stuff. And I think, I think whenever you go, we've had it ourselves with Satellite in the past. When you go somewhere new, there's always going to be some interesting reactions to that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like when it was at the National Harbor, some people love it, some people hate it. And it's always incredible to be in Paris in September. No one is ever going to turn that down. You had another trip attached to World Space Business Week. You went to Luxembourg for SES's new brand launch. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, Rachel, this is not my normal life to anyone who's listening to
Yeah,
this.
really a jet setter, Mark.
Yeah, like, 2 countries in 24 hours and going to a multitude of events. Um, Going back to the SES, I mean, firstly, thank you to Suzanne and the team for inviting us to that. Really appreciated the invitation. What I will say is, I'm really struck that we know about the new brand, and Adele seemed to really emphasize the comments now. The comments where the hard work starts now. We're a new company, and it's that fine line between being proud of your legacy and proud of your past, but not being tied to it. And I think they understand that that they're operating in a very, very different environment than the SES of 10 or 20 years ago. And they're going to be challenged. And, it's, they're trying to, you know, really figure out their place in this new world. And I think it's going to be a fascinating challenge for them because they are one of the great companies in space. I mean, they've been around for decades, and but this is a competitive market now, and I think they they want to have almost like a new identity now, and I think the brand fits in with you know it's bright purple colors. They're trying to be vibrant, new, and not be a 40, 50 year old company, but
Hmm.
actually, and I think it's a very it's a balancing act, and I think it'll be interesting to see how they get on. Obviously, the big thing with them is like multi-orbit and having this collection of assets, and whether that message can actually resonate with can resonate with customers. I mean, it's going
Yeah,
to be
I thought that
powerful.
Adele was I thought his keynote or his fireside chat was very interesting, and I think a lot of people are rethinking what a satellite network is right now when he talked about the meosphere of that it's not okay, we are going to launch 12 or 16 MEO satellites and this is the exact format. It's okay, we are going to have cascading development, and this launch might be different from this launch, and bringing innovation, like bringing new innovation to orbit each year. I thought that was very interesting. And also, speaking of new and disruptive manufacturers, they are going to work with K2 Space, a startup based in LA, to test some new technology. And I think that they're launching a demonstration like even as soon as next year. So I love seeing more traditional companies work with newer players. That's one of my those collaborations are always some of my favorites. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it was. They're a very interesting company to watch now. I mean, I think with the acquisition of Intelsat and a new brand, and Adele, let's be clear, he's a relatively new CEO in this industry as well. I mean, it feels like weirdly he's probably been in the industry a lot longer than he has, because I think I think he's a very dynamic speaker, and and he's someone that's new to the industry, has a telecoms background, and he's got some very. I think he understands that the challenges ahead for SES, and I think they're going to be as bold as they can be. Whether that's bold enough, we will see over the course of the next few years. But it's going to be. You could also argue sometimes. I go back to the defense stuff that we talked about at the start of the conversation. I always one of my one of my favorite phrases, Rachel. I don't think I ever told you this before. So
Okay, I'm curious.
sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and sometimes it's about being in the right place at the right time. And to become the CEO at a time when all of a sudden Europe is ramping up defense budgets, that's probably something that most of us probably would not have predicted a few years ago. No one necessarily predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine, and then that would lead to this geopolitical identity crisis that Europe may be undergoing right now. And then and obviously the impact of the Trump administration and Europe figuring, well, we may have to spend more on defense now, and bigger NATO commitments. So there's a number of factors here, and I always think sometimes in life, and it can apply anywhere in life, and professionally or personally. Sometimes it's almost like being in the right place at the right time. And sometimes you are in your personal life, sometimes you are in your professional life. And I think to become the CEO of a big European company, or I mean, they would argue they're global, but they're based.
Yes, yeah.
But to become at a time, and all of a sudden, European governments, or governments even all over the world, are saying, well, we need to spend more money on this stuff. That must be a great time to come in, because the opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
they still have to execute. So it's not a slam dunk, but at the same time, it, there are worse times to become the CEO of SES. I
Mm-hmm.
think.
All right. So, for anybody that's made it all the way through, thank you for listening to us. And I'm going to have one final question. What was one of your favorite parts of being in Paris?
The happy hour that we did with Umbra was fantastic. Um, it was great. I hadn't worked with Umbra before. It was great working with them for the first time. Um, we had a great event, and really enjoyed talking with a lot of people there. And I took a picture with me behind the bar as well. Not
Yeah,
that
you behind the bar. That was really funny.